In this session now, we're focusing on women, and we've just heard about women's education. What I'd like to look at is the association of household food insecurity with the quality and quantity of women's diets and their nutritional status. And I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors. Just as background, we know that household food insecurity is considered a chronic cause of inadequate dietary intake and undernutrition. We also know of documented reports where women, in deference to, if they're under a food-stressed environment, will eat less in deference to giving their husbands and children more or better quality of food, and therefore would sacrifice some of their own intake and dietary diversity. Yet women in the reproductive years, if dietary intake is inadequate due to particularly the increased dietary and nutrient requirements before, during, and after pregnancy, if dietary needs aren't met, they certainly can have consequences for her health as well as her infant's health. And we also know that indices of dietary quality or diversity may be sensitive to household food insecurity, some socioeconomic stress, and food inaccessibility. So we took the opportunity to examine the relationship between the direction and strength of association between women's dietary diversity and household food insecurity, as well as look at the direction and strength of the association between women's nutritional status as defined by her mid-upper arm circumference and body mass index with level of household food insecurity. And we used data from the POSHAN community studies, panel data that was collected, I think Dr. West mentioned the study itself, in 23 districts across the country, 63 wards across the mountains, hills, and the Terai. In this study, or for these analyses, we focused on women of reproductive age, and this was women with children under 5 years of age or newly married women, and that meant newly married within the previous 2 years. And we had approximately 4,500 such women included in this analysis. Our exposure variable, we've heard about a little bit yesterday, was household food insecurity as measured by the 9-item household food insecurity axis scale. And this scale has 9 questions, and it goes from increasing from less concern to much greater concern about food insufficiency. So from worry about having enough food to actually insufficient food quality, maybe limiting variety or the kinds of foods that can be consumed, and then eating, in fact, less or disruptive eating patterns. And these then get categorized into either not having a perceived food insecurity, low, moderate, or severe perceived stress. Our outcomes that we looked at were related to women's dietary intake. And these were derived from a 7-day food frequency that had 49 items. And the variables that we created were mean weekly frequency of intake from each of 10 food groups. And that, again, is based on the most recent groupings that were recommended under the FAO, USAID, and I think FANTA publication. The proportion of consuming any foods from those groups in the previous week. We also created a weekly dietary diversity score where we summed the number of groups of those foods that women consumed in the previous week, which was ranged from 0 to 10, because there were 0 up to 10 groups. We also constructed a daily dietary diversity score, and that was based on women who had consumed 7 or more of those items in the week. So if you divide 7 by 7 days in the week, you'd get more or less 1 per day. So that's what we did. And the criteria for adequacy is more than 5 or more foods, and these are the 10 groups of foods that we used. Grains, legumes. You can see them here. I think they've been talked about earlier. The other outcome that we looked at was women's nutritional status, and as I mentioned, that was through measured mid-upper arm circumference and body mass index. And then we examined, of course, other potential confounders ranging from women's characteristics, her age, her parity, her schooling, which we actually found quite interesting relationship, household size, caste, religion, monthly food expenditure, wealth index, and of course, agroecological zones, mountains, hills, and terai. We initially looked at these in a very simplistic way, bivariate analysis, and then a logistic regression that was unadjusted and adjusted to examine the odds of consuming any of the food items in each of the food groups by level of household food insecurity. We did a similar kind of analysis, but using linear regression to examine the differences in how often those foods were consumed per group. And then we also did the same to look at, to examine the relationship between women's nutritional status and household food insecurity. And the analyses were adjusted for cluster design. So I want to first paint a picture of what household food insecurity looked like in 2013 and just give you a flavor for how it varies by terrain and wealth, for example. So here we can see the moderate, severe, mild, moderate, and severe stratified by the agroecological zones. And as you'd expect, the mountains were the worst off with respect to food insecurity, followed by the hills and then the terai. And that kind of resonates with a lot of other data that has been found. What's interesting here is here you have the 9 facets or components of the food insecurity access scale. And here we have wealth quintiles. So moving from being worried about food to going a whole day without eating, a much more severe condition. And you can see it performs quite well across the quintiles, with the poorest thinking about food and being concerned about it much more than the wealthiest as well. And those rank relationships occur all the way to the more severe forms of disruptive eating, not having enough. We also looked at coping strategies. So if people didn't have enough food, how did they cope? And what you again see quite interesting is, again, by food insecurity status, most people who were from a severely food insecure household took cash or took loans. And again, we can begin to think about, from Dr. Mushtaq's presentation today on the ultra poor, how those temporary insults can in fact drive people to some destitution. But clearly a relationship between how people cope under food stress. And one other thing I'd like to mention, we also ask about monthly food provisioning. In other words, which months of the year did you feel there was not enough food for your family? And you can see the seasonal nature of food insecurity. Again, this by severity or level of food insecurity. With those not being food insecure, pretty much feeling, we've got enough food across the year. Those, however, with severe food insecurity, having these big spikes throughout the year. And our data was collected between May and July. And so the estimates we have of food insecurity and the categorization is probably an underestimate, because as you can see, we stratify a very food insecure period, but also one that is less food insecure. So we examined again household characteristics by level of food insecurity, and you'd see what you'd expect. Better educated, women from better educated households came from much less food insecure families. Here you had 5 versus 1 year of schooling. Interestingly, caste predicts this very well. And if you look at the Dalits, you're looking at probably close to 60+% who were food insecure, with the largest proportion, again, being of the castes, the Dalits being coming from food insecure households. We looked at land ownership, and again, those with little land are more food insecure. And we also looked at and asked about how much rice was stored. And as you can see here as well, those who had less rice stored were from households that perceived food insecurity more acutely. Okay, so what's the relationship between level of household food insecurity and dietary diversity? And here we can see there's a clear relationship between households that had no perceived food insecurity to those that had severe. One thing to take note of is this is in the past week. Even those who were non-food insecure, women had consumed only 7 of those 10 food groups. Here we look at the relationship between food insecurity and the proportion of women who consume food from these various food groups. And just a reminder of what Dr. West spoke about earlier today was there's actually, if we draw a line across here, you'd see that a very small proportion of households are consuming some of the more sort of nutrient-dense food groups, such as dairy, eggs particularly, but not too much variation, obviously, in terms of grains, a little bit with respect to pulses. And the stars there show significant differences by level of food insecurity. Here we're looking at it slightly differently. Here's a compilation of the number of times women have consumed the various food groups and the total number of items consumed for that 7-day food frequency. And you can see, just in terms of the total count, large differences between women who come from non-food insecure households to those who come from progressively more food insecure households. So again, the idea is both quality and, at least in terms of quantity, as far as mean frequency of consumption of foods from these items, are associated with food insecurity. Now, we did try to calculate this new daily dietary diversity score for women, and just totally, that is the proportion of women who are consuming 5 or more of these 10 items in a day of the total population was 16%. And again, a very clear association between a gradient by household level of food insecurity with, again, the most severe meeting, only 8% of them meeting that minimum dietary diversity. Again, now some adjusted results from the same analysis. So we adjusted for maternal education, for parity, for agroecological zone, wealth quintile, food expenditure. And again, we see here that those items in red are the ones that women who came from food insecure households on average consumed the odds of consuming were much less. Every one of these is essentially under 1, which means compared to the food secure households, the odds of them consuming those foods from those groups was less. And those in red are significantly less. When we look at it from a quantity perspective, we can see, again, the same sort of relationship. Here you can see the mean number of times that women in the non-food insecure groups consumed foods from these food groups. And this is the decrement in relationship to those. And you can see, again, in red, almost all negative signs. So again, very obvious. And this is all adjusted analyses. And the ones in red are statistically significantly different from those with, who had no food insecurity. If we look now at nutritional status and the relationship with food insecurity, a couple of things you'll notice. Here we look at low BMI, and that is BMI less than 18.5, and a low MUAC, and that is a MUAC of less than 22.5 centimeters. And the first thing that you can see is that you have about 20+% of women who would be considered undernourished with respect to these two nutritional indicators. And you can see, again, the association between increasing level of food insecurity and increasing level of maternal or women's undernutrition. When one adjusts, again, for women's age, number of children at 5, women's schooling, agroecological zone, here are the unadjusted values, and you can see, again, a incremental decrease, so half a BMI index less to an entire BMI score less. This is the adjusted model, so you can see it's slightly more attenuated. And we had one more model where we included the wealth index. And here, in fact, the relationship washed out a bit. So, in fact, in this case, when you adjusted for wealth index, that relationship was no longer statistically significant. For mid-upper arm circumference, again, In an unadjusted model, you can see a half a centimeter to a centimeter less in terms of MUAC. When we adjust for it, it's somewhat attenuated. And when we add, again, a socioeconomic status indicator, it's much, much more attenuated and only remains statistically significant in one of the groups. So the key messages here are the pattern of dietary risk and poor nutritional status, the poor dietary quality of women's diets. It was only 15.9% met the minimum dietary diversity level. There were very high levels of maternal undernutrition. Both women's dietary diversity and nutritional status worsens with increased severity of household food insecurity. And the decline in the maternal diversity was largely due to reductions in really all types of animal-sourced foods, pulses, nuts and seeds, and other vitamin A-rich fruits and vegetables. The pattern of dietary risk and poor nutritional status was most clearly explained by the wealth index. And so we think, obviously, impoverishment is a major driver of low dietary diversity and poor women's nutritional status. The index we used was fairly good at finding and identifying households potentially for targeting, whether it be for agricultural interventions or nutrition and income generation interventions. And we think that interventions to promote food security may be most effective if they are targeted toward the poorest households, the most food insecure households, and include some sort of an income component. And again, this is a cross-sectional study, so we did not capture the full breadth of the seasonality, so a little bit of caution needs to be taken there. I'd like to acknowledge the support through the mission of USAID, Feed the Future, New Era, our government colleagues, the Innovation Lab, local team, and Tufts University. Thank you very much.